This is the true story of Troy. This is the cradle of Western civilization. Mainland Greece on the west and Asia Minor on the east, and dozens of islands in between. The Aegean Sea links the inhabitants of this region, seafaring adventurers and their legends of gods and heroes. For thousands of years, fortune seekers and archaeologists have been searching these shores for evidence of the Trojan War. And now, some say they have found it. Today, not far off the pristine coast of the Aegean Sea, in what is now the modern country of Turkey, an international team is excavating what they believe to be the site of legendary Troy. They claim they're finding evidence of a 5-acre city, complete with palace, streets, and a vibrant downtown. Dating to the late Bronze Age, the prehistoric time of the Trojan War. But, as in all things Trojan, there is a conflict raging. Did Troy actually exist? Why does its memory echo through time?
I think the Trojan War is the original source of so many of our cultural expectations of soldiers, of literature, of human behavior, of the interplay between the divine and the mundane. So much of our cultural tradition originates in the Trojan War that we continue to value it, even unconsciously, as a source of the archetypes upon which we model our behavior.
Historians of the ancient world never doubted the Trojan War was history.
Herodotus, Thucydides, and most other major figures of the Greek and Roman world assumed that the Trojan War was a historical fact.
Things of great moment tended to in the ancient world, and it began with the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, destined incidentally to be the parents of Achilles, the greatest of the Greek warriors at Troy. And they invited all the celebrities of the ancient world, all the gods, all the goddesses, except one. They didn't think it was a very good idea to invite Discord.
Discord shows up anyway. She offers a golden apple inscribed with the words, "For the fairest." 3 goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, claim the apple and ask Zeus to be the judge. He wisely declines and instead appoints Paris, the handsome prince of Troy.
And as often happens, each of the contestants offered a bribe. The one he gave the prize to, Aphrodite, offered him the bribe of the most beautiful woman in the world. But there was one problem. That woman was married. She was Helen, married to Menelaus, king of Sparta.
Paris sails for Sparta under the guise of official Trojan business.
When Menelaus, his host, was absent, he eloped with Helen back to Troy, and thus unleashed the fury that would become the Trojan War. Menelaus appealed to his brother Agamemnon, who was the overlord of the Greeks at that time. And Agamemnon summoned together all the Greek cities, all the kings, for a war of revenge to right the wrong that had been done to his brother.
1,000 ships assemble, but the gods cause the winds to cease. To appease the gods, Agamemnon must make the ultimate sacrifice: the ritual slaying of his own daughter. The winds blow, the fleet sails, and the war begins. The Greeks encamp around the walls of Troy, and for the next 10 long years, heroes are made and destroyed on the battlefield. Achilles, the celebrated Greek warrior, and Hector, the Trojan champion.
As the war began to drag on in the 10th year, and it looked as if there was no end in sight, so the Greeks devised the ruse of the Trojan horse. The Greeks sailed off, and the Trojan horse was left outside the walls. The Trojans broke their walls down to let the horse enter, stuffed full as it was with Greek soldiers. And in the night, as the Trojans were celebrating, down came the Greeks out of the wooden horse, let in their companions, and proceeded to rape, pillage, and destroy. Many acts of vandalism were committed in that time. Priam was slaughtered at his own altar. Cassandra was raped. And the infant son of Hector was thrown from the walls of Troy, his brains dashed out. And even then, after Troy had been totally destroyed, the end was not in sight. As we know from the Odyssey, Odysseus was to wander for many years before he got home. Agamemnon returned to domestic turmoil. His wife, Clytemnestra, had been having an affair with her lover, and with him plotted the death of Agamemnon. So the homecoming of the Greeks was, for them, as devastating as was the destruction of Troy.
Like Troy, what is known of Homer is a mixture of history and myth. Although he is credited as the author of Western civilization's first works of literature, the Iliad and the Odyssey, very little evidence of Homer exists. Some scholars estimate that he lived around 750 BC, and that the father of Greek literature was from a place not far from Troy.
We think that he came from a region probably fairly close to Troy, perhaps from the city of Smyrna or from the island of Chios, but even this is doubtful. There's a strong tradition that he was blind, but other than that, virtually nothing can be said with any certainty about him.
Two of the greatest mysteries about Homer concern how someone who lived 500 years after the Trojan War can recall such graphic details of battle and bloodshed.
Is it plausible, therefore, that there really was a Trojan War, and that at least the fact of the war was passed down through oral tradition for 400 years or so until 800 BC, when Homer's poems were finally taken down? My own opinion is that this is plausible. There must, in fact, have been a Trojan War. Otherwise, why would anybody have sung about it in the first place?
Parry's work confirms that one person can not only memorize songs as long as the Iliad and Odyssey, but that the accounts can be historically true. For the first time, there is an understanding of how the story of Troy could survive 500 years until the time of Homer, and how Homer's greatness is born.
Homer must have been a very famous singer in his day. He must have been like the Rolling Stones. He was a very famous entertainer of some kind. It's plausible that his greatness as a poet, which is proven by the Iliad and the Odyssey, by his brilliant poems that have survived, did inspire somebody to record these stories. Indeed, the very man who invented the technological means that made the recording possible, that is, the Greek alphabet.
Before Homer, epic stories were memorized and sung. These oral tales were usually performed at the feasts of aristocrats and noblemen. But Homer's story of Troy was so powerful that someone wanted a way to record the words and teach them to others. The problem was the Greeks had no system of writing. So one theory is that this someone, the first Greek scribe, adapts the Phoenician writing system, adds vowels, and invents the Greek alphabet to record the words of Homer.
Here's an example based upon early epigraphic remains of what this text might have looked like. It begins on the right-hand side. back and forth, as the ox turns, the Greeks said, comparing this style of riding to the plowing of a field where you plow up one end and back the other and then back again.
Now, with Homer singing to a scribe, these heroic stories of Troy, the first in Greek history to be written down, inspire a much greater audience.
In my opinion, is because they were the first texts that ever existed in the Greek vocal alphabet. And as such, they were used from the very beginning as the basis for instruction about how to use this writing system. And they never stopped being that. So when you went to school in ancient Greece, you studied the text of Homer, right back to the day that the man who invented the alphabet first wrote them down.
Homer's story of Troy becomes the tool by which language and literature are taught, the very foundation of Western civilization. For the next 3,000 years, his story of Troy will inspire the greatest Greek and Roman writers, Renaissance artists, Shakespeare, and even Hollywood films. But over the centuries, the true story of Troy is blurred by myth, and Troy the city, a ruin even at the time of Homer, is covered by the sands of time and lost. Then, in the 19th century, inspired by Homer's account of battle, blood, lust, and deceit, a rich adventurer goes in search of the treasures and the true story of Troy. It is a Bronze Age clash of cultures, a battle over the most beautiful woman in the world. This tale of heroes, blood, lust, and deceit from a time before writing is sung for hundreds of years. Then the greatest of Greek singers, Homer, sings of Troy so powerfully, he inspires the invention of the Greek alphabet. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey are the first written works of ancient Greece and become the foundation of Western civilization. But over time, the story of Troy is obscured by myth, and the city is lost. Now, can Homer's Iliad and Odyssey lead explorers to the treasures of this legendary city and rediscover the true story of Troy? July 6th, 1827. After centuries of Ottoman occupation, Greece wins its independence and emerges as a new nation. Europe is smitten with everything Greek, and Homer's Iliad and Odyssey ignite Trojan fever. With a pick in one hand and the Iliad in the other, a German-American self-made millionaire, Heinrich Schliemann, sets off to uncover Troy.
Heinrich Schliemann is actually a fascinating man. He's a Wall Street tycoon of the 19th century. He made a great deal of money speculating in Russia and in the United States, including the gold rush in California. Having made a great deal of money and therefore being able to retire from his business pursuits, he at this point can go and pursue what he claimed was a lifelong fixation with Greece and particularly with the Trojan War.
Heinrich Schliemann has a knack for finding gold. He is in California for the gold rush, makes millions in St. Petersburg under the Tsars, and in his search for profit and adventure, he dresses as a Bedouin, circumcises himself, and sneaks into Mecca. In 1868, he moves to Athens and launches a campaign throughout the Aegean in search of the legends of Homer and ultimately Troy.
Schliemann was not an archaeologist, but he had a sacred faith in Homer. I mean, Homer was his Bible. And this led him to discover things which nobody else had thought of discovering, of looking for, let's say.
Schliemann sets out to look for a place that matches the landscape described by Homer in the Iliad. A vast plain where two great armies can battle, near the Aegean Sea, between the Scamander and Simois rivers. A place with high fortified walls, from which the Trojans could watch in horror as their champion Hector is dragged behind the chariot of Achilles around the city. Elizabeth Reardon, architect for the excavations currently underway at Troy, retraces Schliemann's steps on the plains of modern Turkey.
Heinrich Schliemann was convinced that Homer was writing about a place that actually existed. And he was also convinced that this place here, known as Hisarlik, was where he was going to find Troy. He thought that if he excavated all the way down to bedrock, whatever it was he found at the bottom had to be the Troy that Homer had written about.
In 1870, Schliemann and his hundreds of workers plow through thousands of years of civilization, cutting trenches in the mound running north to south and east to west. The Trojan plain becomes littered with Schliemann's piles of what he considered rubble. He digs for years, but finds no evidence of Homer's Troy. He's getting desperate.
What he really needed was a big, splashy find. The man was very lucky because at the end of his third year of excavating, he made a find that fit that bill. He was investigating this very large fortification wall when they uncovered in a small pocket a treasure trove of gold objects. This was exactly the kind of find that he needed to get attention.
Golden cups and goblets, highly polished stones and precious jewels. In 1873, Schliemann smuggles the treasure out of Turkey, dresses his wife in the jewels like Helen of Troy, and with Barnum-like showmanship, claims he has uncovered King Priam's treasure. He dazzles the world with headlines. Heinrich Schliemann discovers legendary Troy. But the showman's headlines prove false. The treasure Schliemann finds dates to 2,500 years earlier than Priam and does not correspond to the time of the Trojan War. And worse, Schliemann may have stolen his discovery of Homer's Troy.
Schliemann, with his interest in Homer, was not the first in this area. Frank Calvert, a British expatriate, had been living in the area from 1845 onward. He grew up in this area and gradually amassed a tremendous amount of textual evidence for where Troy lay.
When Schliemann arrives in Turkey, there are several sites thought to be Homer's Troy. But Frank Calvert is convinced that the land he owns, a mound named Hisarlik, is Ilium, an ancient Greco-Roman city from which Homer titles his Iliad. Schliemann seeks out Frank Calvert.
When Schliemann came to the Calvert house in August 1868, Calvert's house was full of artifacts and works of art that Calvert had excavated from Hisarlik, from Troy. Now, when they had dinner, Calvert told Schliemann all about his excavations, showed him what he had found, and Schliemann was clearly very impressed.
Schliemann goes back to Athens, and without ever setting foot on the site, writes his first book on Troy. The problem is, he doesn't know the details.
Calvert wrote Schliemann answers to Schliemann's many questions, one of which was, how high was the mound? Was it 20 meters or 100 meters high? The very fact that Schliemann would ask this question shows that he had absolutely no concept of the site itself.
Though Calvert has been quietly digging by himself for years, Schliemann pours his vast wealth into a grand excavation with hundreds of workers and is anything but quiet. Schliemann tells the world that he is the sole discoverer of Troy and literally leaves Frank Calvert in the dust. Despite false claims of Priam's treasure and accusations of stealing the site of Troy from Frank Calvert, Heinrich Schliemann convinces the world that Hisarlik is the site of Homer's Troy, and that the Trojan War is real.
Schliemann was somebody who dedicated his life, his fortune, and his activities to proving Homer true. And this has my respect.
It's largely because of Schliemann that we're asking the question, was this war real? Today we still follow in that tradition in asking questions about the Trojan War.
But even Heinrich Schliemann, perhaps the most devout believer in the Iliad as history, can't produce definitive proof of Homer's Troy. Somewhere in these ruins is the promise of finding some scrap of writing, some Trojan treasure to prove beyond doubt that the Trojan War and the story of Troy are real. It is the most legendary war in history, fought around 1250 BC in the prehistoric Bronze Age. The tale of lust and battle is sung for 500 years, until Homer's story of Troy, the Iliad, inspires the invention of the Greek alphabet. Over the next 2,000 years, the legendary city is lost, until in the 1870s, Heinrich Schliemann, with pick in one hand and Iliad in the other, claims to discover the site of the Trojan War. But his showmanship and unscrupulous ways cast doubt on his claims. And worse, his excavations destroy so much of the site that it is condemned as an unreliable witness in the search for the true story of Troy. Inside, they discover a treasure trove of opulent relics and murals, glorifying Mycenaean war and conquest.
We have scenes, beautiful scenes of a besieged city with tall buildings and women looking out of the windows, warriors, chariots, and horses. One cannot but think that these scenes reflect, or at least echo in some way, all the adventures of the Mycenaeans in southwest and northwest Asia Minor.
On the terrace of the palace, overlooking the rich valley and beyond to the Aegean, perhaps dreaming of conquering Troy, kings like Agamemnon would feast with fellow warlords. Homer describes such a feast that takes place across the Peloponnesian Peninsula in Pylos, in the kingdom of wise old King Nestor, another hero of the Trojan War. Here, in 1996, in the basement of a regional museum, archaeologist Sharon Stocker finds boxes of burnt animal bones. Stored there by the famous archaeologist Carl Blegen more than 50 years ago and labeled table scraps. Stocker finds something peculiar about them.
What we have represented here are bones from the thighs and the mandibles of bulls, male cattle, and probably about 10 individuals are represented.
The meat from 10 cattle can feed 6,000 people. And the fact that the remains are specific body parts, and all from male bulls, makes Stocker and archaeologist Jack Davis suspect they have something more than table scraps.
It was here that he found the objects that we've been most interested in.
Yes.
That is, in this corner, more or less, must have been the gigantic heap of animal bones.
Clearly, the bones represent the animals eaten at the feast.
A little bit closer to the wall in here had to be the spearhead.
The spearhead is likely to be the butchering tool.
And then I think off here must have been the pile of little kielikas, the miniature drinking cups.
In Blegen's 1950s excavation, thousands of kielikis were discovered in every corner and corridor of Nestor's palace, representing thousands of guests drinking.
All of these objects were grouped in close proximity here, one to another.
But they also find one more piece of evidence. written in a primitive script known as Linear B. Translated in the 1950s, the tablet reveals another purpose for the feast.
So it's about here that the tablet was found that proves that sacrifices were in the process of being made in honor of the god Poseidon.
Piecing together the evidence, Stocker and Davis paint a clear picture of feasting in the Bronze Age. Then the guests, as Homer says, ate well, and no man's hunger lacked a share of the banquet. The young men brimmed the mixing bowls with wine and poured rounds for all.
They would have seen the power of the kings displayed there on the walls above them as they were participating in the feast, as a kind of reminder of what the Mycenaeans were capable of doing.
Yes.
By providing this feast and sacrifice, the king presents himself as the messenger to the gods, and his call to war as divine destiny. Surely the feast in this setting is a persuasive weapon for a king luring warriors to join him in a battle against the Trojans. But as a final appeasement to the gods, King Agamemnon must make the ultimate sacrifice: the ritual murder of his own daughter. Helen, Queen of Sparta, is abducted by Paris, Prince of Troy. A personal attack on family honor escalates to an international crisis. With enticements of wealth and power, King Agamemnon forges an unwilling coalition of Mycenaean Greek warlords to do battle with the Trojans. But now, the gods and his warriors demand from him the ultimate sacrifice: the ritual murder of his own daughter. This is the true story of Troy. At perhaps the most disturbing intersection of mythology and history lies the practice of human sacrifice. How can an act considered the ultimate sacrilege in the modern world be so prevalent to the ancients? Classics professor Robert Garland on a beach not unlike that of Troy.
Human sacrifice is committed by Agamemnon. Achilles, we are told, slaughters 12 Trojan youths to appease the spirit of his friend Patroclus. And at the end of the war, Polyxena is sacrificed at the grave of Achilles.
Although these incidents of human sacrifice exist in the mythological realm, there is also historical evidence of human sacrifice. From Egypt to Babylon, slave and prisoner sacrifice is widespread during the Bronze Age, often used as a public display of the king's power. But could the Greeks, founders of Western civilization, also have practiced human sacrifice?
There seems to be some archaeological record of human sacrifice. I'm just going to mention certain chamber tombs here in the area of Mycenae, where we have found bodies of slaves, one on top of the other. They were probably slaughtered when their master died, or prisoners of war, and so on and so forth. To them, it was not probably a human sacrifice. What we consider human sacrifice is not the same thing with what they consider human sacrifice. A slave or a prisoner of war is an object, is not a human being.
Interestingly, although human sacrifice is prevalent in the mythology of Greece and the Trojan War, Homer never mentions it in the Iliad. It's a few hundred years after Homer when some of the greatest Greek playwrights incorporate human sacrifice into their stories of the Trojan War. One reason may have been as a storytelling device to entertain their audiences.
It's often true that forms of religious behavior that were once sacrosanct and received great veneration later on become the subject for horror and a way of getting a chill, really, out of the audience.
So in the story of the Trojan War, Agamemnon succeeds at assembling a coalition of Mycenaean warriors. But as they ready to set sail for Troy, the winds blow against them. The oracle tells Agamemnon, for favorable winds, he must sacrifice his daughter, Iphigenia.
He did so by summoning her to Aulis on the pretext that she was going to be married to Achilles. Instead, he butchered her, and in so doing, set in train a terrible set of events that would end in his own death.
To the Greeks, this was a powerful message, whether real or mythological. In war, a king asks his subjects to sacrifice the lives of their sons. Now the king, by offering his daughter, is making a similar sacrifice. The Greeks may see it as democratic and egalitarian. If not us, why not the king? And if not our sons, why not his daughter?
To us, the idea of sacrificing Iphigenia seems horrific.
This war, in a certain sense, had to be. More forces had been unleashed than could now be contained. But at that short, brief moment of time, Homer seems to be saying, this is how conflict should be resolved between the only interested parties.
Though ending a war with a duel between two leaders may be wishful fantasy, many of Homer's observations of battle are timelessly true.
One of the underlying themes that you draw out of the Iliad and the Odyssey that remains relevant today in a military setting is that character matters. That theme remains with us. We still are very concerned for the character of our officers and our soldiers.
Modern armies can learn from the soldiers of the Trojan War. But the greatest of the Greek warriors, Achilles, might not last long in today's army. In front of other warlords, Achilles threatens and insults Agamemnon, his commanding officer.
What a worthless, burnt-out coward I'd be called if I would submit to you and all your orders. Whatever you blurt out, fling them at others. Don't give me commands. Never again, I trust, will Achilles yield to you.
To Homer's audience, Achilles' rage against Agamemnon reflects a conflicted hero defending his honor. But today, his insults would be court-martialed as insubordination.
Achilles was preoccupied with his reputation and his personal standing amongst the Greeks. The absolute opposite of a team player. Odysseus is of course a different character, and again he's yet another expression of the fact that character matters. He is wily. He's compared to a fox. Even today we compare some of our most capable military figures to foxes.
The swamp fox, Francis Marion of the American Revolution, and General Franks of the war in Iraq are among some with reputations of cunning like a fox. But Homer highlights another key quality of leadership by demonstrating the opposite.
Never once did you arm with the troops and go to battle. You lacked the courage. King who devours his people.
Unlike an ideal general like George Washington, who leads his troops by example, Agamemnon is accused of hanging out in the back while others fight and die.
Agamemnon is arrogant, overweening, very much given to advance his own personal agenda, and inclined in the mind of others to take advantage of his position for his personal gain rather than to be a servant of the rest.
Ironically, the soldier who is idealized by Homer is Hector, who fights for Troy. He has the character of the model soldier and citizen.
Hector is more inclined to set the welfare of his people and his city above his own reputation and his own survival. And ultimately, he faced down Achilles even though he knew that the odds were against him and that his time was up.
The battle between the two greatest heroes, Greek Achilles and Trojan Hector, is the climax of the Iliad and Homer's story of Troy. When Hector takes leave of his wife and child on his way to battle, Homer foreshadows the end of the war and tilts the sympathies of his audience in favor of the Trojans.
Hector envisages that Andromache will be a widow and that his son Astyanax will be an orphan. And like any true husband there, he says, I care for you more than I do for my countrymen. It's your fate that really matters to me.
Homer portrays Hector as a family man. While the Greeks are fighting for revenge and greed, Hector is fighting to defend his wife, his child, and his home.
The Trojans, in a sense, are us, and it is through their eyes, very largely, through the eyes of men like Hector, that we read the events that are going to be so shattering.
Hector sees Achilles charging like a stallion. Achilles closes, helmet flashing, throws his spear and misses. Hector hurls his spear, striking Achilles' shield dead center, and glances off. Hector draws his sword and charges, but Achilles has a second spear and drives it clean through Hector's neck. Hector falls to the dust and gasps, pleading with Achilles to return his dead body to Troy. But Achilles promises to feed his body to the dogs, lashes his corpse to his chariot, whips his horses to run around the walls of Troy, and as Homer says, defiles Hector's body in the land of his own fathers. And in the last great scene of Homer's poem, King Priam comes to beg for the mutilated body of Hector, his son.
King Priam comes and he grasps the man-slaying hands of Achilles, and like a suppliant, he appeals to Achilles' compassion. And Achilles yields, and the two men collapse together in an acknowledgement of their human identity. They're no longer Greek and Trojan. They're no longer deadly enemies. Instead, they are like father and son.
It is here where Homer reveals his subversive mission. He ends what is perhaps the world's greatest war story with an anti-war message.
We are all human. We are all fathers and sons. We all have attachments that go way beyond our national identity. We are human beings, first and foremost.
A truce is declared for the cremation of Hector's body. Funeral laments are sung. The flames from the fire consume his corpse, and looming are the walls of Troy.
Homer does not elect for a Hollywood ending. He elects for an ending which reminds us that more slaughter is to follow. Homer is saying to us, his audience, in a way, you are not to be trusted. More havoc will surely follow. More brutality, more carnage, and ultimately, too, the destruction of Troy.
Although this completes Homer's story, the true story of Troy does not end here. Suddenly, the Greeks are gone, and a wooden horse stands outside the gates of Troy. greatest Trojan hero, Hector, is dead. Killed in battle by the Greek hero Achilles. After defiling Hector's body, Achilles agrees to surrender Hector's corpse to the Trojans. An uneasy truce is called as Hector is cremated before the walls of Troy. But when dawn breaks and the Trojans brace for another Greek attack, they discover their enemy is gone and a wooden horse stands outside the city gates. This is the true story of Troy. The most famous symbol of Troy, the Trojan horse, comes to us from legends other than Homer's Iliad.
The legend tells us that this was a war that was not won by uncommon acts of valor, by steadfastness and military discipline, all the qualities that we might expect. On the contrary, it was won by a devastating ruse. It was won by deception, deceit, and conspiracy, and all the things that we might consider to be dishonorable in the conduct of warfare.
Everyone knows the story. After 10 years of battle, the Greeks and Trojans fight to a standstill. Then Odysseus comes up with a plan. The Greeks build a giant wooden horse, leave it as an offering to the Trojans, and then sail away. Some Trojans are skeptical. Laocoon warns, beware of Greeks bearing gifts. But myth says he and his sons are silenced by serpents that drag them into the sea. The Trojans desperately want to believe that the horse is a peace offering.
And the Trojans broke their walls down to let the horse enter, stuffed full as it was with Greek soldiers. And in the night, as the Trojans were celebrating the departure of the Greeks, down came the Greeks out of the wooden horse, let in their companions, and proceeded to rape, pillage, and destroy.
By hiding in the belly of the wooden horse and tricking the Trojans into lowering their guard, the Greeks finally penetrate the massive walls of Troy. All of Hector's fears, why he was willing to risk his life to defend his homeland, are about to become true.
Priam was slaughtered at his own altar. Cassandra was raped. And the infant son of Hector was thrown from the walls of Troy, his brains dashed out.
With Hector's mother and father hacked to pieces, his sister sacrificed, his son murdered, and his wife carried off to the bed of a conquering Greek, his family's seed is wiped from the earth forever. For the Greeks, this hard-earned victory means honor restored, the riches of Troy, and Helen. But although there is plenty of archaeological evidence of Troy being destroyed, how could the legend of the Trojan horse be true?
The Trojan horse has become something of a metaphor for trickery, you know, for being able to outwit your opponent, for having something that is so carefully contrived of an artifice that you're given an overwhelming advantage. The idea that the Greeks would have in fact built a large wooden horse, hidden inside it, and had it dragged inside of Troy is certainly possible, but it kind of strains your credulity a little bit that someone really could have pulled that off. My inclination is to see in the Trojan horse some kind of a representation, vaguely remembered, of siege equipment, the weaponry that can be brought up against walls to either bring them down or to somehow neutralize them.
Hittites and Assyrians possessed siege technology. It's possible this Bronze Age weapon of mass destruction could have inspired the legend of the Trojan horse. But whether history or myth, the Trojan horse came to symbolize a war won by trickery and deception.
What the legend seems to be telling us is that even though this war was fought for a just cause of sorts, and even though in the end right won, in the sense that the Greeks were victors, nonetheless, that victory was at such cost that it put into question the whole validity of the war itself.
Achilles meets his death, struck in his heel by an arrow from the bow of Paris. Odysseus is doomed to wander for another 10 long years before he gets home. Menelaus readies to kill Helen, his unfaithful wife, but when he sees her naked beauty, drops his sword. They too take 10 years to find their way back to Sparta. And as for Agamemnon, on his first night home in Mycenae, Clytemnestra, his queen, having never forgiven her husband for the sacrifice of their daughter, assassinates him in his victory bath.
So the homecoming of the Greeks was for them as devastating as was the destruction of Troy.
In fact, history tells us in the wake of the Trojan War, not only do the Mycenaean kingdoms collapse, but the entire Bronze Age comes to an end. There is much speculation as to its cause: civil war, outside invaders, or a string of devastating earthquakes. Greece falls into a dark age for nearly the next 500 years, until the time of Homer. What survives through the Dark Ages is the story of Troy.
The Iliad and the Odyssey had enormous impact in the Archaic period, the 7th, 6th, 5th centuries BC. And so, by extension, it's not surprising that people wanted to go to the site where that war was believed to have taken place. Then the residents realized that they need to market the city very aggressively, almost like a Disneyland of antiquity.
The site of Troy rises from ruin to major tourist destination. Ancient burial mounds are turned into monuments to Greek and Trojan heroes. Temples and theaters are built to their gods. And maidens reenact scenes from the fall of Troy.
They would sing sections of the Iliad and the Odyssey in the agora, in the marketplace of the city, right in front of the old Bronze Age fortification walls.
As the city is rebuilt, history and myth become one, and Troy becomes a war prize in a worldwide conflict.
The Trojan War, among other things, resonates because, from the perspective of many people in antiquity down to the present time, it was a conflict between East and West.
In a way, it's the beginning of the combative stances of both sides. It's us against them.
Now, the tourist destination of Troy attracts more than just tourists. First, Persian King Xerxes stops at the site in 480 BC on his way to sack Greece, claiming to avenge his Trojan ancestors. Then, in 334 BC, Alexander the Great stops at Troy to pay homage to Achilles on his way to Persia.
He goes to the Temple of Athena, where he saw a range of armaments associated with the Trojan War. And he looked at the armor that was presented there, chose one set of armor to wear himself in his battle against the Persians. I like to think that it would be that of Achilles, although we don't know that for certain, and then goes off to fight the Persians wearing Trojan War armor.
Alexander the Great conquers Persia, avenging Greece and reclaiming Troy as part of the Western world. Just as Alexander links himself to the Greek hero Achilles, Julius Caesar claims lineage to the Trojan hero Aeneas. And Rome adopts Troy as its mother city. But the Romans embrace more than a mythological connection to Troy. They also model their ideal soldier on that of Trojan hero Hector.
The Romans would say that the ideal soldier was disciplined, was a team player, was willing to sacrifice himself for the welfare of others, was willing to efface his personal glory for the good of the whole.
The military success of the Roman legions is a tribute to the legacy of the Trojans. Even though the Greeks originally defeat the Trojans are avenged when Rome battles Greece.
It's ironic that the Trojan refugees led by Aeneas are purported to have been the ancestors of the Romans, and the Romans in turn conquered the Greeks. And so it's as if history came full circle. The Trojans were conquered and then became the conquerors.
Troy and its stories are the oldest uninterrupted memories of our world. Troy is beauty, language, power, sacrifice, vanity, honor, deceit, and war. From literature to archaeology, history to mythology, Homer to Hollywood, we believe so strongly in Troy that the question of whether it is real or not hardly seems to matter. The search for the true story of Troy will live forever.